Health inspectors. What's the worst thing you've ever found when inspecting a restaurant/shop? Story 1. A restaurateur was trying to reopen a failed one into a new one. It had been a Mexican joint and was going to be a deli. I was working for a pest control company, and they called us to take care of a few bugs. No big deal. They're just proactive. I get there. It's clean, smells okay, but I'm about 1 month into this new job and experience. I'm going to get started, and I'm mixing up the smeg we have to use in restaurants, and I'm using the water from one of their triple sinks. The water is coming out hot. It's a Vegas summer, so I'm letting it run until it cools down some. I look over at the floor sink the triple sink drains into, and there's a lot of German cockroaches coming out of it. Frack it. This water will do. I fill up the 2 gallons, put the pump and handle back in and shake it to mix it up, pump it to pressurize it, and get to work. When you start with a full canister, there's less air, so you have to stop and pause to repump it to keep the pressure up. As I'm hitting all the cracks and crevices behind the sinks, the equipment, under everything, the seam in the wiped-down plastic walls, etc., roaches are just pouring out into the open. It's in the thousands stage, where now, when I stand still, they're trying to hide under my boots. The last time I have to stop to pump up the canister, I'm standing on its stainless steel with the brass handle between my feet. Frack this. I call on the radio for a coworker who I know is nearby because he has a fog unit, and I don't at this point. Newly hired, wasn't 100% kitted out. Tony swings by. I'm waiting outside, and we renegotiate the service. The new owner had been a little on the light side with the depth of his problem. He agrees. We get to fogging. Tony's showing me how to do it, so I'm just walking behind him. At this point, there's tens of thousands of roaches everywhere. Floor, walls, ceiling. We get to the walking, and above it, where I think the compressor was a 4-foot by 8-foot by 10-foot space. Tony directs the fog stream up in there. Then the roaches start pouring out. Pouring out in such numbers that briefly you can barely see the stainless steel of the walk-in door. The entire rest of the day, any little itch on my skin, you're leaping to slap it and check it's not a roach stuck on you. That sounds like a living nightmare. If I hadn't seen it for myself, and if it was on film, I would have probably thought it was some sort of CGI kind of thing. But yeah, this is also one of those lists that's probably going to make me happy that I've been preparing food at home for the last week or so. I still want to go for a pizza. Let's see if that still happens by the end of this video. Story 2. High-end Thai place in a popular tourist area. Go downstairs to the kitchen and open up the freezer. On the top shelf of the freezer, they're storing loose beef, pork, and chicken in 3 separate piles. The meats are not in any containers. They're all sitting on a large piece of cardboard the restaurant had placed on the bottom of the shelf. We poke the cardboard, and our finger goes right through it. The juices from the 3 meats had turned the cardboard into pulp. We then notice it dripping from the combined sludge of chicken, pork, and beef blood. From the looks of the cardboard, it had been dripping for a while. We looked to the shelf below to see the results of the drip. Underneath the meats, in the shelf second from the top, the restaurant was storing 3 buckets of ice cream. Without lids. Directly under the meat drip. We look inside the ice cream containers and see congealed, partially frozen, cardboard-laced raw meat drippings pooled in the center of each tub of ice cream. None of the ice creams were more than halfway full. We asked the kitchen manager how long they've been storing their items like this. He doesn't remember. At least a few months. My theory is because the place was A, nice restaurant, and B, an ethnic restaurant, patrons were less likely to complain about odd flavors. For example, instead of complaining about blood in the ice cream, wondering out loud if that taste is star. That's one of the few inspections that made me feel physically sick. Place still gets an A because the restaurant grade system in my city is about as effective as the TSA. Ugh. Now see, I've been to Thailand before, and this kind of storage system wouldn't fly at a lot of restaurants over there. They're very particular, and over there I've eaten spicy food, but I've never gotten sick from eating any of the food over there. So I think this is just they're trying to get away with what they said, being ethnic, and no one's complaining about weird flavors. Story 3. Health inspector here. Here are my top 3. 1. An old liquor store, which had once been the front unit of a housing duplex, had now been converted into a full-service deli. Sandwiches, fried chicken, etc., without plan review, so they were severely lacking in all the proper space and equipment. Observed were rat infestation, droppings everywhere in the place, mountains of old cast-off equipment in the back giving the rats a home, meat defrosting on the hood of an inoperable car on the side alley, back unit of duplex, now converted to food storage, had unfinished wooden boards on the floor which were now soft and rotting from soaking up years of meat juice and everything else. 2. While inspecting a Chinese buffet, I noted to the employees that there were tubs of frozen fried shrimp stacked on top of one another without covers, so they needed to discard the top layers of the food and put on the tub lids. As they scrambled to do so, they knocked over the tower of shrimp, spilling it everywhere. As I was standing there, they hurriedly started scooping the shrimp off the floor and back into the tubs. I'm standing right here, you guys. A guy ordered commercial sausage-making equipment delivered to his private home. Manufacturer got suspicious and tipped off the health department. Turns out, the guy would go hunting all sorts of exotic game meat without permits, process them into sausage in his rat-infested garage, droppings the size of jelly beans, and was selling them to the public. Don't buy food from home cooks, folks. Yeah, that's the kind of sausage that sounds like it would go really well with pink sauce. What do you think? Also, that must have been the very third story. It wasn't marked. Story 4. Hello. Walked into a restaurant in the morning before lunch rush and saw the cooks actively preparing raw chicken in the dirty mop sink. The cook said that the cooking process would make it safe to eat. Walked into a taco shop and found a reach-down cooler infested with German cockroaches. When I brought it to the owner's attention, he was in denial and said that the health department is constantly trying to pick on the little guys. As he was talking, a full adult cockroach appeared on the counter, and without hesitation, he took the knife used to cut burritos, stabbed it, then began to place the knife back to its original location. Received a complaint of a heavy grease smell coming from a restaurant. Showed up and saw that the owner had been dumping grease outside because his drains were clogged and backing up. Saw that every floor drain he had was actively overflowing and there was sewage all over the floor. Since his drain lines were installed incorrectly, all the sewage water back-siphoned into the ice machine and food prep sink. While this was all happening, they were still serving food and taking orders as if it wasn't a big deal. The cook would cut chicken, then switch to using a plunger on the drains, then back to cutting chicken without ever washing his hands. Walked into a market with an owner who was visibly nervous. As we were talking, I noticed a large amount of blood in the drains. There were also a lot of black bags containing meat products with no labels or proof of where they purchased it. As I lifted the drain cover, there was blood and bones inside. Later found out that the staff were bringing live goats into the kitchen and unaliving them on site. Story 5. I worked in the deli of a convenience store for nearly 15 years. It was a constant struggle to explain to my boss how I couldn't save the leftover chicken and veggies and sell them the next morning. My customers were happy to pay more knowing the food was always fresh. 6 months ago, My boss decided to lease out the kitchen and move me to the main store. Ex-customers keep coming to me to complain about the food tasting bad and making them sick, so I went back to check and counted about 6 violations that would get them shut down or fined. Clorox bleach stored on the floor next to chicken breading, defrosting meat stored above the vegetables, it drips down onto the veggies, and at the end of the day, the cook takes all the food trays and puts them uncovered into the fridge to sell the next day without letting them at least cool down. It smells like rotting food back there since they never clean out the drains. I've also seen her cutting uncooked meat with a machete on the bare floor as she never ices down the raw chicken at the end of the day, so it starts to stink by midweek. Boss has lost half his regular customer base. Story 6. Not an inspector, but I worked at a sushi and hibachi restaurant for about a year as a server, host, and delivery driver. This place had a ton of things that were certainly questionable, but a few of them ended up causing me to leave the place. In the dry storage area, they had cleaning chemicals directly above all the to-go food packages and plasticsware. In that same room, which was really big, I'd randomly see a sleeping bag and pillow tucked away every once in a while. It always stuck out, but I never really thought too much until I went back to grab a bottle of wine, and sure enough, had stepped on a sleeping woman. She started yelling, and I just ran out. My manager pulled me aside later, which I assume was going to be a conversation about keeping that hush-hush, but no. The dude offered me $25,000 to marry a Thai chick so she could get a green card. My response to him was my 2 weeks' notice. I'm even surprised you gave a notice at all. Yeah, most people would just walk out. On the other hand, with the job market the way it is, I know some people who have worked more than a year at the job they currently have, and they've been offered much less perks than $25,000 in offers of a marriage. Story 7. Did pest control for 10 years and saw some smeg. I happened to get picked to take care of roaches and mice at a very heavily populated Somali business-type area. It spans about 2 city blocks and houses restaurants and shops. It was basically a 4-wall warehouse partitioned off into sections inside. The horrors of roaches and mice in these restaurants was unlike anything I've seen. Literally, both creatures walking over your feet, over the food, on the counters, in and out of the coolers, stoves, food storage bins, you name it. We eventually gave up rather quickly since the restaurant owners didn't really care and didn't help us out by sealing foods and cleaning and whatnot. I had asked the owner of the building, the man who initially called us, why haven't they been shut down by the city, and he said, because no white people come here, so no one cares. Never again will I do pest control. Story 8. A tuna canning plant in Los Angeles was off of Terminal Island. The processing plant owned the entire island a few miles offshore. Needless to say, I had to take a boat to the plant to look at some machinery they needed repaired. We get to the plant, and there are dozens of cats inside the plant, outside the plant, warehouse, etc. Cats everywhere. Nobody said anything. They were even in the office building. After a few trips, I finally asked. One guy said in a joke, "It's either rats or cats. We don't have a rat problem here." I worked at a grocery store in Manhattan. Our exterminator brought us a cat, and we took the points for having a pet versus having bugs and rodents. The only mouse I ever saw there was in the process of being eaten by the cat. Story 9. Late to the party, but I used to work on my own as a baker in a supermarket, and the cleaners would come in at 10 p.m. at night when the last worker left, and he would be finished by 2 a.m. when I arrived. Well, one day I was half an hour early, and I walked up to my department, and the cleaner was mopping the prep tables and the equipment with the same water he had used to clean the floor. I wish I was joking. To use the mop on the tables to begin with is stupid, but using the same water as well? Insane. I told his boss when he came in because I simply had to, and his face was a picture. He really didn't believe me until I got him to have a look at CCTV. Oh, I forgot. He wasn't supposed to even touch the machinery. That was my job. So he was dirtying my already clean equipment. Honestly, I'm willing to bet real money that this cleaner was never trained on anything. just kind of thrown the mop and bucket and told to have at it with vague instructions. I'm pretty sure. Do you think he was just thrown into the deep end and he was making an innocent mistake? Let me know what you think. Story 10. Actual health inspector. The worst I've heard between my coworkers is a place that had mice floating in buckets in the basement with severe soiling of all surfaces. It was closed until they could clean it up. The worst I've inspected, at least in terms of public health safety, was a place that let their sandwich-making food sit out on a countertop without any cooling, and they were also using a residential dishwasher that couldn't sanitize their dishes. Owner just didn't manage any of their employees. Owners make a huge difference. It's super obvious if they're consistently involved in care. We know the back of the house gets warned and all chefs and staff throw on gloves real quick, but it's easy to spot when something is a chronic issue. Sometimes we're limited in our actions, though, and it varies by departments. Some have more teeth than others. Story 11. Was a health inspector long ago. Was at a Golden Corral going through the kitchen area. As I was squatting down to check a dishwasher, my foot broke through the tile floor and into a sewer pipe that ran underneath. Cockroaches come boiling out of the hole. Turns out the entire floor was rotten from a water leak in the sewer pipe. Best and worst part? The general manager tried to fight me when I told them that they had to close down until they fixed the open hole into a pipe full of cockroaches and waste. I just picture your foot stuck in the hole still with roaches pouring out and the manager coming up to you with an Irish fighting stance. Story 12. Not a health inspector, but I used to be a busboy at a nice Italian restaurant in my hometown. We had problems with a Chinese place across the street because we found out that they had been taking the lettuce that we threw in the dumpster at the end of the night. Our manager used to stand outside and guard the dumpster so they wouldn't take our garbage. Another experience working at a local cafe. I was cutting up cheese from a walk-in fridge, and I found a hole in the cardboard box that the cheese was kept in. Turned out it was from rats or mice, and they were eating the cheese. Told my manager about it, and he told me to cut around the bite marks and still use the cheese. Left that job shortly after. Story 13. In the mid-'80s, I managed a pizza delivery store, and the health inspector came by kind of late and asked me to step outside. He started by apologizing, but it was his job to follow up when they have a specific complaint concerning food safety. But this one was odd. He proceeded to tell me a customer complained that while they were in the store, 2 male workers had spicy time on the counter and didn't even wash their hands. I very dryly responded that couldn't have happened, as we always wash our hands after having spicy time on the cutting table. With a small grin, he said, that's what he thought, and he appreciated our efforts. He was our inspector for several years after that.
Please like and subscribe if you made it this far. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the video and have a wonderful day.
Story 14. I do a lot of polishing and chrome plating. I am not a health inspector, but I do a lot of work for restaurants. I got a call to chrome plate some refrigerator racks. It's a common request. These are large 36 to 48-inch long racks and grills that the food sits on. This one high-end steakhouse that I used to go to calls me in. Their racks were literally falling apart. Rusted joints, old food hanging off of them. Just disgusting. I explained it can't be repaired, but they insisted that we just shine them up, do whatever is needed. I refused the job, left, and wanted to throw up. Never went to that restaurant again. Immediately called the health department on them. Don't know what happened. Story 15. There are so many horrible Chinese restaurants in this thread, so I thought I'd give a shout out to the one I used to work at years ago. The owner was meticulous about cleanliness. Every night, the kitchen staff would scrub the floor and everything else down with soap and hot water. The dishwasher ran so hot you could see the steam rising and had to wait for them to cool down before you could touch them without burning your hands. The place was clean and served some of the best Chinese food. The owner eventually retired and sold his land. Boy, do I miss the hot and sour soup. Good to hear there's a clean Chinese restaurant in this thread. Story 16. Not an inspector, but my significant other told me about what happened at a popular seafood restaurant in my town. A guy working the fry station had a magnetic kitchen timer above the fryer stuck to the hood vent above. One day, the timer fell into the hot grease. They managed to fish out the main plastic part, but the batteries were nowhere to be found. It was determined that the batteries must have disintegrated into the grease. Being a seafood restaurant in the South, half the menu is fried. The owner is too much of a skinflint to stop serving fried food and change out the grease during dinner rush. So whoever ate catfish that night had it fried in a tangy, alkaline grease. Story 17. The current kebab shop I work at. Everything is clean, well kept, everything is well maintained. The owner has a twin who also decided to open a kebab shop. I went to visit a few weeks ago. The cheesecakes are left in low-temperature cupboards rather than freezers, which isn't cold enough, so they have bright green mold. Every single egg there is expired. I checked with the egg in a water test. The pizza doughs have all gone bad. You can even tell from the smell. There were milk cartons in the fridge that have been there for around 2 months. He offered me to come work there for £9 an hour, which in England is a lot for someone my age. I said no, and I don't regret it. A health inspector is going to come there soon and close it anyway, hopefully. Story 18. So a friend of mine is a health inspector. She walks into a local convenience store and discovers a litter box behind the counter. Totally unacceptable. Tells the proprietor that he needs to get rid of the litter box. That's kind of a health code violation. He replies, "Well, it's for the cat. We've been having mice and rat issues." To which she's all, "Oh." Cat walks up. She tells him he can't have a cat in a food establishment. He hands the cat to his wife, and she takes it out of the store to their camper trailer nearby the store, waiting for her to leave. Rinse and repeat. In New York City, every corner store has a cat that hangs out there. Story 19. Worked in a popular sandwich shop. Our floor drains were smelling rancid for weeks and were backing up with what we assumed to be sewage. My manager told our owners every single day for 3 weeks that this needed to be fixed, and they did nothing. So in the middle of my shift one day, a health inspector came in and immediately shut us down. My manager told me right there that she anonymously called the health department because that was the only way the owners were going to end up fixing the problem. Good manager. Story 20. Not a health inspector, but I've seen some stuff. The worst was a restaurant a friend took me to. He loved it and said it was on him, but deity dang if it wasn't the sketchiest joint. If he hadn't spent the whole trip talking about how he eats there twice a week and loved it so much, I probably would have left. The place was disgusting. Mold on the walls, dirty floors, piles of unwashed dishes on the customer tables, etc. When we left, I happened to notice the health inspection sign. They'd gotten a 36 out of 100. I didn't even know it was possible to score that low and stay open. Story 21. Not exactly a health inspector, but I work with licensure for healthcare facilities. You'd be surprised how many of them are totally unprepared for emergencies and would probably all expire if there was a fire or worse. My dad lives in a senior independent living facility. About 90% of the people use walkers. Every 6 months or so, there's a round of removing walkers from the dining room to free up space, followed by an ADA complaint that restores the walkers. If there was a fire during one of those spats, I can't imagine the headline. Story 22. I once finished up a foodborne illness investigation, not finding much that could have caused the illness, and left. I parked my car on the other side of the street in full view of the restaurant I was just at. I watched the dishwasher come out the back door, light a cigarette, smoke for a minute, then hunch over and fracking puke all over the grass. Then he took another drag and went back inside. I have mild emetophobia, so I got a bit of a cold sweat, then ran across the street and basically dragged his butt outside. I've got a lot of stories, but that was the worst for me. Story 23. Guys, it's my first time in Bangkok, Thailand. I just went on a food tour. I don't know if you know about Bangkok, but it's humid as hell here. Some of the vendors had fish sitting in cardboard. Flies, cockroaches, rats, etc., as far as the eye can see. I ate all the food, though. I'll let you know if I pass away. Hi, I was in Bangkok a few years ago. I also ate some of that left-out cardboard-laying fish. Did not expire. I hope the same for you, friend. Story 24. I helped my dad run his restaurant for a good 5 years, and my dad was, and still is to this day, a big fan of people seeing the fresh food as it was made. So we never had doors to the kitchen from either customer entry point, despite my insistence on it. Sure enough, it was the only thing the health inspector ever docked us for, and my dad solved the problem by just putting doors in, but never closing them. Not sure why doors are needed since fast food restaurants don't use them. Story 25. Not a good inspector, but once I ordered tacos from a high-end vegan restaurant in LA. When I bit into the taco, I felt immediately a hard chunk gently slice into the roof of my mouth. I pulled out a 1-inch shard of glass from my taco. Management said they accidentally broke a glass near the tacos, and they thought they got all of it. They offered a new plate of free tacos, but I was like, my mouth is bleeding. Why would I want another taco? At least it was vegan glass. Story 26. Not a health inspector, but an ex-shift manager at Sbarro. I watched the general manager regularly drop dough on the ground, pick it up, dust it off, and then continue to prep it for pizzas. He also told the entire staff to cut around the mold on the produce because it was too costly to buy new produce when our stock went bad. He was a bad GM. They also promoted him to a much busier location, and I regularly tell people not to eat there. Story 27. I can tell you what they didn't find. When I worked at Denny's when the health inspector came, the cooks took all the expired food out of the fridge and stored it in their cars and by the dumpster until after the health inspector left, and then they put it all back. I ended up quitting that job after I got written up for refusing to change the dates on the labels of all the expired food, which was one of the primary jobs of the graveyard server. Story 28. I'm a New York dairy inspector, and I inspect a lot of Jewish dairies. What I've noticed is the Jewish community in my area loves to do their own inspection. The problem is they leave milk bulk tank doors open, and rats, flies, and other critters get into the milk. The big problem is they never ask to do the inspection. They just walk onto the property and do their thing. Actions like that can shut down the whole industry. Story 29. 14-inch border of mold/dirt scum all the way around the edge of the restaurant. Boxes that had 5-year-old shipping labels blocking the path to the mops and mop buckets and mop sink. No sanitizer buckets. No sanitizer clothes. No sanitizer. Mold in the fans blowing over open food in the cooler. Didn't bother finishing the inspection, just shut them down. Story 30. Not a health inspector, but read public health inspection reviews. There was a Burger King near me that had black mold in the ice machine and large holes in the kitchen where rats had eaten the walls and burrowed through. There was also a KFC that was cited for having broken glass and other debris on the serving line? I really don't get that one. Story 31. I worked as a chef in San Francisco for a couple of years. Every restaurant I worked in was clean, but most of them still had a rat problem, including rat droppings on food-safe surfaces. At those places, we plastic-wrapped everything, including plates and silverware and surfaces we put food on nightly. Some of those old cities, it's very difficult to really get rid of them completely. Story 32. Our local health inspector told us a funny conversation he had with a restaurant owner. Health inspector pulls bug out of already prepared food. What's this? Owner. That's a bean. Health inspector. Beans don't have legs. Story 33. Worked in a restaurant, and whenever a health inspector came, I had to go to the kitchen to tell the cooks to put on gloves and hairnets. It's not that they didn't wash their hands or anything. They were old school with cooking. But still, it was a violation. Story 34. Not a health inspector, but when I was in my late teens, I worked at a 5-star restaurant where they were using potatoes and other produce with maggots in them consistently. Restaurants like these easily charge people $285 to $350 a head for events like New Year's Eve. They got shut down. Story 35. Lifeguard here. One time, the GMM of chlorine in the baby pool was around 45. The optimal is 1 to 3. The health inspector was not happy about it. This is how you cook the baby.
Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.